So let's get started, guys, because we certainly have a lot to cover, especially, I think, in our regular housekeeping. Okay, so for today, you should have read chapter 26. You had your regular Achieve assignment last night, although it seems as though there was a small hiccup there with being able to have multiple attempts to answer a question and having access to the correct answers. So let me see if I can undo whatever setting it is that I set and make that accessible for you guys so that you can use it in your exam prep. Speaking of exam, you have your exam on Tuesday, March 9th. Here on the slide, you have the chapters that it will be covering. It's not covering today's material, okay? So you don't have to worry about that. Actually, let me take these next two bullet points out of order. So anyone who has approved extra time, two people have notified me so far. If you have approved extra time, you need to get in touch with me. You need to get in touch with me right away. You need to get in touch with me in a written format, so I would suggest email. You need to send me proof of the approval, okay? And I will make sure that you have the time that is approved for you for the exam. Now, the exam itself. I heard everything that you guys had concerns about on Tuesday with regards to having an exam in Blackboard. I think that you probably are speaking from experience. You've all had nightmare scenarios, I guess, during exams. So here's what we're going to do. You are going to not have the exam in Blackboard. You're going to have the exam in Achieve. Okay, so we have the ability to put together an exam and give it to you in an acceptable format in Achieve. You all have been doing your assignments in Achieve, so you are all familiar with how to answer the questions, so on, so on, so on. Your exam will be all multiple choice type questions, okay? So again, formats that you are familiar with in Achieve. You will have that available to you. You will have 75 minutes to complete the exam. I have not finalized every single set of questions. And hang on a second, Melissa. I have not finalized every single set of questions. My target is 50 questions, but as I said, it will most certainly be between 40 and 60, but I'm targeting 50. This way, each one will be worth an even 2 points. Not so little that it's insignificant, but not so great that you've got so much riding on any single question. Okay. Now, as far as who has written the questions have been written. So what I've done is, in order to make this work, I have put together a rather extensive list of questions of every single type. So for everything that we've covered, and you will get one randomly assigned question from a bank of questions. So in other words, not all of you are going to get the same question, okay? And actually, I have recruited an impressive number of people to help me with this. So thank you to all of them, particularly the grad students who have been working on things. So you're going to get a randomly assigned question out of a group. I don't know. So let's say there's a specific question on a specific key concept. There may be, I don't know, 10 questions, just to use round numbers. In that bank, you will get one of those 10 questions. The answer choices will come from another bank. So you will get, even if even if two students see the same question, the answer choices besides the correct answer will may be different. No, absolutely will, but there's a probability they'll be randomly assigned, they'll be different, and the answer choices themselves, the order will be different. So if the correct answer for the first person is A, for the second person it may be C. So those are some of the capabilities that we have in Achieve. Yes, Melissa, you have a question and you had typed one, so go ahead.
Yeah, so this might be a little bit of a silly question, but I'm a bit confused. So let's say there are four like options as answers, so we would have three different wrong ones. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's
Oh, okay.
completely it's completely immaterial. The wrong ones don't really matter.
Right.
Okay, it's the correct one that you have to get to. So, and the wrong ones are not like preposterous ones, right? So they'll all make sense. So there's really been quite a bit of work that's been going on behind the scenes to put this all together, and we had a big shift since Tuesday to make this all work in Achieve. The Achieve people have been really good about this, so thank you to them for all the resources that they've made available. So, well, listen, you got. We are reacting to your concerns. So let's hope that this works. Okay. Now, as far as backtracking, I am still of two minds about it. Let me finish getting everything set up. And this weekend, I will post an announcement on Blackboard in our class with basically a lot of the information I've just given you that's relevant. So you're taking it on Achieve, right? So the exam is on Achieve. It's all multiple choice. You have 75 minutes, things like that. Okay. So I will also include the time that it opens and the time that it closes. You don't all have to start it at the exact same moment. But you will have a countdown timer that gives you the time, and that's it. And you need to make sure that you're done by the time that the exam itself closes. So, don't show up at 1:10 thinking that you've got 75 minutes to complete the exam, because the exam is going to close, at 1:30. Okay. Don't worry about your grades, worry about performing well. Okay. That's what I'd like to stress. Okay, your concern should be on getting yourself prepped and getting yourself ready to take the exam. Giving you as much information as we can give you. And again, after the exam is over, I'm also going to ask for feedback. See, like, again, don't worry about the scores. Worry about getting yourself prepped. Okay. That's going to be your focus. If you're worrying about what the curve is, you're worrying about the wrong things. Okay. Make sure you're ready. Go in as prepared as possible, and then things should work out as best as possible. Again, we're trying to use the technology available to us, given the fact that we are online this semester. So I too am hopeful that this works out, and I will be asking for feedback on the format of the exam after the exam is all said and done. Okay, Sarah, you have a question.
Hi, Professor. I'm just wondering, are the questions going to be the same style wording as the homework that we've been having previously?
Yes, that's been something that I have in particular been trying to pay attention to in finalizing the questions, is to make sure that the way that the questions look, sound, for lack of a better way of saying it, feel, is going to be similar to the kinds of questions, the style of the questions that you have been asked to this point. The good news in that, and one of my motivating factors, has been that you guys have been performing well. on those assignments. So hopefully this will also work to your benefit.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay. All right. So that's Tuesday. Tuesday's the exam. If you run into problems, your internet, I don't know, explodes, or something along those lines, I will be on email duty. Okay. So you need to email me. You need to email me immediately. We will do the best that we can, given the situation. But I have been reassured that this should go along pretty smoothly. So again, thank you to the Achieve people for helping out with this. So, okay, now that's Tuesday. Wednesday night, you have another assignment due for Chapter 27, and we will cover Chapter 27 on Thursday. Okay? Last chance for questions about the exam or other housekeeping things before we jump into Chapter 26. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about seedless plants. Here are your key concepts. Just three that we're covering for today. Hopefully we can get through the three. Okay. Now, we talked a lot last week about endosymbiosis, and that endosymbiosis is what we strongly suspect and have good evidence for being the way that photosynthetic eukaryotes came to be, evolved. Okay. Now, when we say plants, we're talking about a huge range. Most of the time when we think of plants, we think of land plants, but that's probably a bias because we are land mammals. Many clades of plants exist in both freshwater and saltwater environments. Algae are obviously aquatic. They're photosynthetic eukaryotes. Okay, but algae can be a very broadly applied term, so you need to be aware of that. So it may not always be referring to something that would be a plant. Now, this is a tree that you saw at the beginning of our last lecture when we were talking about eukaryotes. And we talked about pretty much the gray branches last week. Today, we're going to start diving into this green branch, which is plantae, plants, all plants. We are not going to be talking about all plants today. We're going to be talking about seedless plants, okay? Plants is, again, a very big field, and we will need more than one lecture to cover it. So let's start sort of dividing up that branch, that plantae branch, right? So here's a little more developed phylogenetic tree, okay, just to give you a sense. And we're going to tackle some of these branches today, starting with the glaucophytes, okay? We think that these are the ancestor of all of plantae, right? Or not that they're the ancestor, but that they are sort of a root branch, okay? That's a more proper way of saying this. Sister group to all other plantae, okay? What we notice about this right away, you can see the chloroplasts in these cells are huge, right? These chloroplasts obviously involved in photosynthesis, and you can see just based upon their size the importance of the role of photosynthesis. Okay, now let's also talk about another sort of sister branch near the root, red algae. Okay, most of these algae are multicellular. They are red, as you can see in a couple of these photos. The red comes from a specific photosynthetic pigment. Most of the chlorophyll that's in these organisms is actually chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A actually is much better at absorbing, if you think about, all of the visible light, okay, is much better at absorbing certain wavelengths of light, and that ends up also kind of lending some of that red color. And the red actually helps with this amount of absorption. Okay, most of these are marine; they live in saltwater environments, although there are some that live in freshwater. And most of them have that hold fast, that same thing that we described last time with the brown algae that they attach to a rock. Remember, I talked about alginate, right? So the part at the base of the algae that attaches is called a holdfast. Okay, so there's a trivia question for you. It'll probably show up on Jeopardy at some point. Again, going back to that chlorophyll A, right? These organisms can live in fairly deep water. Now remember, they're photosynthetic, so they need light. So the light has to be able to get down to whatever depth in the water they are. Okay, so in deep water, there's not a lot of light. It's pretty dim, but the light that penetrates through is actually going to be on the redder side of the spectrum. Okay, so again, it gives you some clues into why they look the way that they do. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about green plants, right? Green plants typically have chlorophyll type A and chlorophyll type B. There are more than just those two kinds of chlorophyll. I think there's like A, B, C, D, and I think there's also an E. Again, not a plant person, so I can certainly get more information for you if you have questions. Okay, so plants that have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and that have the ability to store energy as starch, okay, within the chloroplast, those are the two things that are necessary in order for us to classify them as green plants. Okay, so for instance, chlorophytes are a green plant. This is the largest group of green algae. Most of them live actually in marine environments. They can be unicellular, they can be multicellular. There's a big push going on right now, and I wanted to kind of fill you in on this because this is an expanding area, and I think it will be. So for anybody who's interested in careers in biology, there's a big push for using algal species for a source of biofuels. How do we raise algae and get them to produce as much of a fuel that can then be refined and turned into biofuel as possible? So this is definitely an expanding area. As a matter of fact, one of the really interesting things is that algae like growing on sort of wastewater kinds of nutrients, right? Nutrients, there's a lot of nutrients in wastewater that can basically supply all the needed nutrients for many species of chlorophytes. And so we're looking at ways of using chlorophytes growing on wastewater, which would then be filtering the wastewater, cleaning the wastewater, and then harvesting the chlorophytes to be able to use it as a source for biofuels. It's a pretty interesting sort of approach to take. Okay, so now again, our bias with land plants, so let's start sort of moving toward land plants. Streptophytes, okay? Streptophytes are some of the, again, thinking of that family tree, right? The basal branches there. They are green algae-like, and they have a direct sort of connection to land plants, particularly stoneworts, okay? Many of these seedless plants, you'll hear wort at the end of it. Wort is an old word that means herb. So, so for instance, St. John's wort, St. John's herb, right? And you'll hear others. Okay. Okay. So let's go to embryophytes. Embryophytes are plants where the embryo is protected. Okay, it starts off as part of the parent plant, and the parent plant actually has tissue protecting the plant. 10 major clades here, you can see them in the tree, and we're going to start talking about some of these different clades. We'll talk about the non-vascular plants, right, which are called the bryophytes. Those are your liverworts, right? Again, wort meaning herb. Liverwort, liver herb, it actually comes from the way that the liverwort looks. Someone who named them, thought they looked like sort of liver-shaped. Mosses, I'm sure you're all familiar with mosses, and hornworts, okay? And then we'll talk about vascular plants. There's a lot that had to happen for these plants to be able to move out of the ocean and onto land, right? So if you're going to exist on land and survive on land, water really becomes the first thing and probably the greatest thing that you need to be concerned about, right? So you need to evolve ways to transport water to where you need it, because you're no longer living in water. Okay. You also, since you're not in water, you have to be able to support your own mass. So you have to have physical support. And of course, it becomes a little more complicated to reproduce, right? Because you're no longer just releasing gametes into the water environment. You need to have mechanisms that work in order for gametes to find each other. So some of those key adaptations are things like the cuticle. So if you look at a land plant, you'll notice that on the leaf there is a waxiness, right? That waxy coating is called the cuticle. It holds moisture in. It slows down water loss. This cuticle is actually made up of, obviously, biomolecules, right? So the organism has to produce these molecules. And very interestingly, cuticle wax is actually used in earth science to have a good sense. You can actually find those molecules in layers of sediment on the bottom of the ocean, and you can actually use that to understand what the environment was on land at the time that layer of organic mush was laid down at the bottom of the ocean. Another thing that I find amazingly interesting are stomata. Stomata are specialized cells on leaves that are capable of opening and closing, and they open and close as needed for gas exchange, carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, and also water, right? So they regulate how quickly the plant is going to lose water. So you can imagine that the way that stomata work is going to be very, very different in, say, a cactus that's adapted to very hot environments versus an orchid that is adapted to very humid environments. Okay. I have a very good friend of mine who is actually one of the really few true paleobotanists in the world, and he's at UConn, and he actually uses stomata to understand environmental variables in the ancient past. Stomata can no, so it's not like acne, right? So they can be clogged because they're very small, but there are also ways to clear them, but this is somewhat tangential. Okay, you have to, so other adaptations, you have to protect your gametes, right? You have to be able to secure the ability to reproduce, right? And again, along the same lines, embryos are typically in protective structures. You also have to protect yourself from UV radiation. There's a lot of UV light that hits the surface of the earth. Much of that would be filtered out by water if you're in water, so you need a way to deal with that. Okay, and you can see some of the others, thick spore walls, and another key adaptation is, and this is an important thing to think about in terms of ecology and evolution, this idea that you have to have beneficial relationships, okay, beneficial associations, and there's I mean, you look at ecosystems, there's a massive number of these. But in terms of plants, one of the really key one has to do with different fungi, okay? And fungi particularly that exist in the soil and can help with nutrient availability, both in the soil and the ability to take that up. So some really key adaptations. It's also important to realize that as plants colonize the land, they changed the environment, okay? And they changed it pretty drastically. Some of the ways that they do it, there are acidic compounds that are secreted by plants, particularly, by roots. That's going to help break down rock. And when you break down rock, what does rock become over long periods of time? Soil, right? The basis of soil. So, and then what else is in soil? Organic material. A lot of that organic material is going to come from all the plants that existed before and those being broken down. Okay, now plants have this really interesting thing called the alteration of generations. Okay. You have the diploid plant, and then you have the haploid part of the life cycle, for lack of a better way of saying it. Okay, so you have the multicellular diploid plant. This is called the sporophyte. Okay, in part of the plant called the sporangia, you're going to get meiosis. Okay, and then once you have meiosis, you have haploid cells. Spores are going to develop there in what's called the gametophyte. Okay, so this is and I've got it here, gamete plant. Okay, gametophytes produce the haploid gametes by mitosis, not meiosis because they're already haploid, mitosis. Okay, and then once that happens, you can have fertilization with gametes from other individuals, and then you're going to get the diploid plant again, and then the cycle starts all over again. For very early plants, water again was incredibly key in not just surviving but also reproducing. Okay, sporophyte is going to be dependent in essence on the parent plant, on the diploid plant. Okay, how this all works, you can see in the and this is why I like this particular figure. You can see right here, water playing a direct role in the ability of these plants to reproduce. Okay, it also plays a direct role in the sporophyte and how it's going to get nutrition from the gametophyte. Okay. So first plants were probably non-vascular plants. Non-vascular plants, what we're talking about is going to be the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. Okay, and they all have a lot in common. Those three clades, right? So there's no vascular transport system, which means that they're going to be short. You're not going to have a very tall non-vascular plant. Okay. Water is going to move around just by diffusion or what is caught from something like rain. or from condensation, right? So if you think of something like dew. They don't have very thick cuticles, that waxy bit that keeps water in, not really very thick. So they have to live in environments that are moist naturally, okay? And obviously they don't have true roots or stems or roots, okay? But they're really good at colonizing without soil, places that don't have soil, like rock, right? And again, remember, they're going to be working to help break down the rock. So, and they have associations with these beneficial fungi, right? And these are symbioses that go back very long way, on the order of pretty much 500 million years. Okay, so let's look at some of these clades individually. The liverworts, right? So you have a photo here, right from your textbook. It shows you some of the different liverworts. There's about 9,000 known species. I say known because we don't know all species of anything. Okay, so always expect that as you go on, there will be updates into the numbers of species and their classifications. Okay, these are really short, on the order of just a few millimeters high. Okay, and they can have little tiny stalks, and those stalks are really going to be the sporangium. Okay, so it's going to be, those stalks are going to be, the tallest part of the plant is going to be dedicated to reproduction. Okay, and they can also reproduce asexually. Mosses, you'll see mosses really in most places in the world that you go. You know, there's about 15,000 known species. They have stomata, okay, which is, I think, really interesting. Another interesting thing about mosses is basically what happens when they die. When a moss organism dies, it actually, the way that it dies and desiccates, it can actually become sort of like almost like a little miniature natural aqueduct, helping transport water from one area to another, so that living tissue also has access to water. Let me clarify. It's not dying and forming this way because the living tissue will have more access to water. That is a consequence of the shape that happens when it dies, right? So we have to think about this in terms of natural selection. The mosses that, when they died, sort of created these channels that waters could move. That species was able to survive and reproduce better, and so it was selected. Okay. Hornworts. Not many here. There's only about 100 known species. Okay. Coolest thing about hornworts, they have a really big chloroplast in them. Like, it's huge inside the cells. And the other thing about them is the sporophytes basically can just keep dividing and dividing and dividing as long as resources are there. So in this sense, it really is almost like a sort of throwback to algae, you know. And another thing about them is many of the species have these strong connections to cyanobacteria that can fix nitrogen within specific cavities. Okay, so a lot of information I just threw at you. So let's stop there for a couple of minutes and see if you have questions. No questions? Last chance. Okay, let's keep going. So now let's talk about plants that have vascular tissue. Okay, these are the plants that really were able the plants that we've talked about now, right? The mosses, the liverworts, the hornworts, these non-vascular plants, they need to be close to their sources of moisture, right? The moisture has to come to them, in essence. Vascular plants can move moisture around. This is key because now that opens up the rest of dry land, in essence, to colonization by plants. And that leads to a really rapid expansion and diversification of species. So definition, obviously the vascular plants have ways to transport water, and along with that water, nutrients to different parts of its tissue. Okay, vascular system, has two of the coolest words I think in all of biology: xylem and phloem. Right, xylem takes water from the minerals. Takes water and minerals from the roots and brings it up to the rest of the plant. Phloem goes in the opposite direction. Phloem happens after photosynthesis and is going to distribute that energy created in photosynthesis to the rest of the plant. Okay, so let's talk about that diversification. You saw this figure in a previous lecture, and I'm bringing it back so that we can kind of keep looking and sort of comparing apples to apples, oranges to oranges, kind of a thing. Okay, so let's talk about the mid-Silurian. Okay, about 443 million years ago. That's when the types of cells that are capable of conducting water began evolving, and that was critical for the invasion of true land plants. Where's the Silurian? Well, if we're standing at the top of this pile, right, here's the Silurian, back 443 million years ago. Evolving water and mineral transport and rigid structure, that created a new sort of environmental condition that you could select for: height. Right? You didn't have to be low to the ground anymore. You had all this, for lack of a better way of saying it, biological infrastructure where you could move water and minerals, so you could start to get taller. Getting taller has additional benefits. One, being able to collect more light. Remember, this is the source of your energy. This is what you use to produce food. Okay. The other thing is, remember in the sporangia that we talked about before, right? The tallest part of the plant is going to be producing gametes so that they can be wind dispersed. If you're taller, you get access to basically more air, right? And that will help with reproduction. Okay. So then there is the evolution of a branching sporophyte. That branching sporophyte then becomes highly specialized, producing more and more spores. That also creates new sort of evolutionary selective pressures. The plants that can produce more spores are going to do better in terms of surviving, well, not so much surviving, but reproducing, right? So that then there is competition, right? Directional selection for the ability to create more and more spores. Another key thing that's happening at this point in history is that, or prehistory really, is that these plants had no predators on land. So you may say, if you're natural selection, okay, and you may say to yourself, why go through all this trouble to evolve all this structure, and all these different sort of mechanisms for moving water and minerals and getting up higher into the air? Why do all that? Why not just stay in the ocean? Well, one of the key benefits is that there were no herbivores. There was nothing that was going to eat these plants, destroy these plants on land. So obviously you're going to this is going to be beneficial for the organisms that can exploit this benefit. Once plants move on solidly and establish on land, then it becomes possible. Because remember, they're also changing the environment while they're there. It becomes possible for other types of organisms to come out of the water and move onto land. Here is an artist's sketch of an organism that is called Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is one of the most important fossils that we have thus far found, and it's a really cool story. If you don't know about it, check out. You could. This was work done by a biologist called Neil Shubin at University of Chicago. He actually worked out when in history the Devonian, right? These organisms should have been moving from water onto land, and then said, okay, what was in a very marshy, sort of shallow sea kind of environment in the Devonian, and he identified basically an area of land, and then said, okay, but that area of land would have moved over time because of plate tectonics, and it's been a long time since the Devonian. Where is that plate now? And it turns out it's in northern Canada, sort of Arctic Circle-ish. And he goes there to look for fossils, and he finds this Tiktaalik fossil. So a really interesting story. It's a really, one of those great sort of stories that brings together good deduction, good science, some dogged determination, and get it all together. Dr. Shubin wrote a book called My Inner Fish. So if you ever want to read a science book, and he's actually a really good writer, so you may want to check that book out. Okay. Now let's talk about trees. Okay, trees first appear in the Devonian, about the same time that Tiktaalik is coming out of the water, right? You get the first evolution of trees, okay, in that Devonian. By the time we get to the Carboniferous, okay, you've got forests that are happening, but these forests don't look like the forests today. The environment is different. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air is different. And the types of plants that are going to dominate in a forest is also very different. Okay. Now, here's what's really interesting, though. Those forests that existed on the order of hundreds of millions of years ago, those plants died. They end up getting, organic material ends up getting covered and covered and ends up becoming deeper and deeper and deeper in the Earth's crust. It's just like what we talked about last week, right? Where when things are buried for an extremely long period of time in the Earth, they're going to experience very high temperatures and very high pressures. Those temperatures and pressures over time converted plant material into what we call coal today. Okay, so now you know where coal comes from. Just like last lecture, you learned about where things like petroleum comes from. Okay, so those earliest vascular plants, this is now in the Silurian period. Very few of these species are still around. Most of them are extinct now. Okay. One of the two things that I wanted to stress here are the last two bullet points. Okay. They didn't have real roots. They didn't have real leaves. Okay. Their roots were what are called rhizomes. Okay. Almost sort of like a little bulb-like, or the way that it's depicted here, if you ever see a scallion or a green onion, sort of looks like that, right? So It's not exactly like that, but it might be a good way to kind of think about it in your mind at this point. Okay, and those rhizomes really incredibly important because again of the interactions that it's going to have with the fungi in the soil, right, and to build and reinforce those symbiotic relationships. Okay. Let's talk about lycophytes. Lycophytes are a kind of a subclass of these. They're moss-like, for lack of a better way of saying it, right? About 1,200 species, and they resemble early vascular plants. Okay, during the Permian period, these would have been really on all of the land plates, right? All of the plates, especially, and they would have been able to move around to all the plates fairly easily when there was Pangea. They were eventually replaced by the gymnosperms. Okay, the gymnosperms are plants that have what are called naked seeds, right? What do we mean by that? Well, think about, gymnosperms. The classic examples of gymnosperms are the conifers, right? And you think about something like a pine cone, that the pine cone opens and these seeds then disperse from inside the pine cone. The seeds themselves are not fleshy, right? They're sort of, spore-like in a lot of ways. Okay, there's not much to them in terms of tissue other than the genetic material. Okay, the other classic gymnosperm is the ginkgo plant, which is ginkgo trees are still around. Okay, you also had evolution of what are called horsetails. There's about 15 species in the horsetail genus. We'll talk about ferns in a minute, but nonetheless, horsetails, true roots, right? So the big innovation with horsetails, having true roots, that was, and the ability to root yourself more deeply in the soil. As I said, we'll talk about ferns. So ferns is about 12,000 known species. Some are aquatic, but the vast majority are terrestrial. I'm sure that many of you could pick out most ferns just by looking at them. They all have this sort of a frond looking leaf kind of pattern. But what you probably don't realize is that there are fern trees. And these fern trees can get pretty tall, about 30 meters. Remember, a meter is about a yard, so we're talking about 90 feet. This is a pretty tall tree. Okay, fern life cycle. Excuse me. Ferns do well in moist environments. Okay, one of the reasons that they do well in these moist environments is because water is required to move the male gametes to allow for reproduction to occur. Okay, and you get these sporangia on the underside of the leaves. Okay, so you can see that in the inset picture, and if you ever take a look at a fern, look at the bottom of the leaves, and you'll see these little structures, and those are the sporangia. Okay, evolution of real leaves and real roots. So I mentioned lycophytes having roots before. Maybe I should have moved this slide up, but anyway. You get the beginnings of true leaves along with the evolution of true roots. Okay, and then you also get this other sort of phenomenon called overtopping, which sounds like a small thing, but you have to put it in context, right? So overtopping, you can see sort of in the diagram, has to do with how these plants are branching as they grow upward. Okay, and you get this overtopping where the new branch grows above the old branch. And this creates different abilities to access light. So the higher you go, those leaves, or sort of proto-leaves are going to have more access to light. Okay. Now, when this first evolved, carbon dioxide content in the air was much higher than it is today. So you had access. These organisms had access to plenty of carbon dioxide, which they needed. That's where they get their carbon, right? Photosynthetic organisms get their carbon from carbon dioxide. So they could be smaller. So here we are talking about stomata. And these proto-leaves, these megaphils, right? They could be smaller because you had plenty of carbon dioxide in the Devonian period. So you didn't need as many stomata to open up. So you could have fewer stomata overall. Here you can see sort of what they look like. They have guard cells that allow them to open and close. Stomata also can control heat by allowing water to evaporate, sort of a plant version of sweating, right? So how does sweating cool you? Sweating cools you because you have this water on the surface of your skin, and the heat in your body causes that water to evaporate, leads to cooling of your body. With plants, you open up the stomata, and water inside the leaf then evaporates because of the excess heat in that leaf, and you can cool the plant. Okay. Because there were fewer stomata, overheating would have happened if the megaphils had gotten too large. Remember, the bigger the leaf, the more light you're going to catch. The more light you catch, the more heat is going to build up, right? So if you have few stomata, this could lead to overheating. So this is a leading hypothesis as to why leaves remain small at this point in evolutionary history. Okay. All right, we are like cruising today. I don't know. You guys aren't asking questions. Either this is a really clear lecture or it's horribly convoluted and you guys are just getting lost. I don't know which one it is, but hopefully it's the first. Okay. All right. So let's talk about homospory. And of course, if there's homo something, there's going to be hetero something. So there's homospory and there's heterospory. Okay. So the most ancient vascular plants were homosporous, right? They had one type of spore, okay? What the heck does that mean? It means that the spore carried the ability, it carried both male and female, okay, in essence. That's what it means. Spores produce one type of gametophyte that has both female and male reproductive organs. Okay. Heterospory obviously is going to be different, right? There are two different kinds of spores. One that's going to carry the egg, the ability to produce eggs, I should say, and the other is going to carry the ability to produce, at this point, sperm, not pollen, sperm. Okay. So the one that has the ability to produce eggs, that's called the megalospore. Okay. Megaspore. Sorry. And the one that carries the sperm, microspores. A good way to remember this is that eggs are larger than sperm. So the spore that can produce eggs, mega, the spore that can produce sperm, micro. Heterospory evolved independently in several different groups of vascular plants. In other words, this is convergent evolution. What does that mean? It means that this phenotype was so beneficial that several different lineages sort of struck upon, through natural selection, the same solution to similar problems. Okay. we know in the lineages that this has evolved independently many times, and so we use that as evidence of convergent evolution and what that means. Okay. Now, with that, I'd like to ask a clicker question. Okay, along similar lines from what I was just describing. Okay. So, what statement best explains the possible selective advantage of heterospory in land plants? Take a crack at it, and we can even discuss it. We've got some time. Ingrid, can you see the question on the screen in the slideshow? Yep, there you go. Okay, try logging back into iClicker if you got booted out. Just another couple seconds. Okay, guys, so that was a minute and a half just to give you a sense of timing there, right? So let's see what we've got. And many of you, 83%, selected A. A is the correct answer. Why is it the correct answer? Come on. Why is it the correct answer? Well, obviously diversity, right? I mean, that's right there in the answer. But think about it. Somebody explain it to me.
So I'm gonna crack at it. So
Yeah.
you can eliminate choice B because separating the male and female gametophytes does not reduce the risk. They have equal risk of predation anyway. And then choice C is wrong because while it is true that it conserves energy, that doesn't the proximity of the gametes doesn't help for explaining heterospory.
Okay, good. So that's an excellent approach to tackling the question, right? Process of elimination. Shoshana, you want to take a crack at explaining why A is the correct answer?
Yeah. So if you're having the heterospory, is that it's the different plants are producing different gametes, male versus female gametes. So if they're producing different things, then they're not in competition because they're not producing the same thing anyways.
Well, so that's a really good way of thinking about it, right? So that, you're not in sort of your gametes are no longer in competition with themselves, right? Against themselves, not with themselves. So your gametes are not in competition with your other gametes, right? For an individual organism. That's an interesting approach. Okay. Anybody else? Come on, guys. What the worst that you can do is come up with something that's wrong. You're not gonna, I'm not gonna send you a fine. Michaela, take a crack at it.
So in a way, I thought of it as how when a human produces its sex cells, it has its own set of DNA. So when a woman's egg combines with a man's sperm, they have two different types of DNA, and when it combines, it's like a separate. It basically provides diversity.
Yeah, I like this. I'd like to keep going on this track and develop it a little bit more. Jessica, you wanna give it a shot?
Yeah, so how I thought about it was that we talked about during that time there weren't, land predators. So the real cause of, like, reproduction was to diversify. So that's why I chose A.
Okay, so why am I asking you guys the approaches that you took? One of the things that I want to highlight is it doesn't matter how you get to the solution, right? There's going to be many roads to the correct answer. Okay, exactly right. There's more than one way to find the answer. All of them, if you take the proper steps, are going to work. Use what works in the situation that you're in. Okay, just in those what 4 or 5 answers or explanations of how people got to their answers, right? We saw some really different approaches. That all works. But now I'd like to start thinking about what this answer actually means, right? Why do you want diversity? And I'm sorry, Jessica, I think you were the last person who spoke, right? Talking about diversity there. Why do you want higher genetic diversity? Why is that good? And this is kind of a throwback to one of, or more than one of, the previous lectures. Shoshana, go ahead.
If you have genetic diversity, then you're not going to have, let's say, illnesses that are in the parent plant aren't going to be automatically passed down to the offspring.
Right. So you have less chance of that sort of inbreeding depression kind of effect that we talked about, right? Anybody else?
Is it to
Michaela?
promote?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I don't. Sean, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that is it to promote natural selection, survival of the fittest? Because the more of a
How?
different. Because if you're going to keep producing different offsprings, then eventually there's going to be mutation that helps with selective advantage that allows them to survive longer and reproduce better.
Okay, so yeah, I think you're really right there, and I want to develop that, but I want to give Michaela a chance to also add to this.
Yeah, so going along with what Sean just said about mutation, basically the way it allows diversity allows for evolution to occur.
Yeah, right. I think you guys are right there. Remember those components necessary for evolution to occur, right? By evolution by natural selection. You have to have genetic variation. And this is one of the mechanisms to help produce that genetic variation. And it's not just about mutation here, right? But it's about different combinations of genes, so that if you get genes that come together that are particularly good when they are teamed up in, partnered up in a single organism, that organism is going to survive and reproduce better, right? So there is how natural selection is going to work. So exactly right. Now, this is one of the things that I often find myself doing, and part of it is because I'm an evolutionary biologist, but I always end up thinking about things in terms of evolution or ecology, okay? And I think it helps make sense of the biological world doing this. I've always said that, when we talked about Darwin, that Darwin is the reason that biology exists, right? Before Darwin, biology was not a science. You had separate disciplines. You had zoology, you had botany, right? But you didn't have biology. Biology comes together in one field because evolution sort of unifies it. Okay. And so thinking about things in terms of evolution for me has always been helpful. Nicole, did you have a question or something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I had a question. I was wondering if another advantage of heterospory for genetic diversity was the increased vectors that the two spores could create when they come off of the host plant. If just like the directions that they could go in, if they were different, just led to more genetic diversity by I guess the vectors being able to connect to other plants.
Yeah,
And not just one.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, right? So if you have the you know, the microspores, right? They're going to be much smaller. They can go much further than those megaspores, right? And so this gives you more, the plant, more sort of potential mating opportunities, you know, by being able to send microspores much further. Just, and of course, this is all random, right? You know, they're going to be air carried or water or what have you. But they have an opportunity, you know, there's an increased probability that they'll go further. So you can, you know, you can literally spread your genes further than you would otherwise. This is a good point. Yeah. Okay, great. Guys, I also put in here at the end, and I believe I lost my share, right? Yeah, I got to do it again. I also put in here, because some of these topics are fairly complex, I tried to include some other resources that you can check out, some videos, and even a non-video. So this is some Khan Academy material. I think Khan Academy is great. I use it for stuff, you know, so because I think it's really well put together. In particular, I want to call your attention to this video here. It's a little long. It's like 9 minutes long, but it's actually really pretty good. I think they cover a lot of material. So, you know, I try and put these other sources for you guys. Realize that when you see other sources, it's also pointing you to a place that is a fairly reliable resource. You know, so you know, you know where that resource is. You can potentially use it in the future as well. Okay. All right, so we've got a few minutes, so let me stop this share and see if you guys have questions related to the lecture today as opposed to Khan Academy and MCATs. Any other questions? Any concerns about today's lecture? Okay.
I'm a little confused on the homospory heterospory diagram. Am I able to share my screen?
Give it a shot. Let's see.
Let's see. Can I share? Sorry, everything's a little bit slow for me. Oh, okay. It looks like I can. Oh no, yeah, I'm not allowed to share.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. It's just a way to probably protect from.
I'm looking at the diagrams and I'm kind of confused. Like looking at the heterospores life cycle diagram from the textbook, it has like the 2 circles. So I'm wondering, like, where does it start? I'm kind of confused where it starts, and then also where the completion of it is, like where to start looking at it.
Yeah, so you can, I mean, it's a cycle, so you can look at it from, you know, starting at any point. It doesn't matter. You end up coming around to the same point. That's the beauty of cycles, right? So let's start here at fertilization. This is the figure you're talking about?
There was a different one. It was the yellow and green one that
yeah. Okay.
had the top being haploid and bottom being diploid. Okay. But it's basically the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a little bit clearer, actually. So, but you know, once you have fertilization, right, you go through the sporophyte phase, right? So this is where you're diploid, you're developing the sporophyte. This is about growing and surviving, right? Now, once you get to that point, this is where you can develop through meiosis. You get haploid sort of spores, but those spores are different. Some of them are going to be female, some of them are going to be male. In essence, egg, sperm. Okay? And then they're going to go out basically in the world, however that's going to happen. Wind, or water driven, what have you, okay? And they hopefully are going to go out, so your little microspore goes out and hopefully meets up with a megaspore of, you know, another member of your species, and then you can have fertilization and begin again. So this is not unlike and you know, I don't want to go too far with this analogy. Understand all analogies are limited. Okay, so never take an analogy too far. But this is not unlike sperm and eggs in humans, right?
Yeah, so I was thinking that you know, it helps to like relate it to stuff that we're already familiar with. So I was thinking
Right.
that, you know, as you were describing it, I was thinking that the megaspore and microspore, they're kind of like the predecessor for an ovary, I guess, or a testicle. And then
Hmm.
the gametophyte is the actual ovary or testicle, the factory that's producing the sperm or the egg. And then those sperm and egg are, you know, just like a normal sperm and egg that we think of, which forms a zygote. And the zygote develops into a sporophyte. And then the diploid sporophyte is the one that creates those predecessors again to create the ovaries and testes, which are the gametophytes.
Yeah. So I don't think that's a problem, you know, for you to think of it that way. I've got no problem. I think that works. You know, just understanding, again, it's an analogy.
Right, right, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
and then yeah, basically just remembering that the zygotes after you know, it makes sense since sperm and egg should be haploid. So the zygote's going to be diploid, and then anything that happens from the megaspore on is going to be haploid. Okay, yep, that
Yes.
makes sense.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
great. Thanks so much, Professor.
Thank you. Nicole.
I had a question about this when the embryo develops into a sporophyte and then the
Hmm.
sporophyte develops into a microsporangium. Is the
Yes.
sporophyte like genderless and the size of like a microsporophyte? And then is there like is there like a I guess it wouldn't be the same as XY chromosome, but for the gender to be determined, like when is it determined, and does the sporophyte, if it's a female sporophyte, does it start growing to become bigger? And if
Okay.
it's a male, does it stay the same size?
Right. 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 Okay. So a couple of things. So one, biology, we're not talking about gender, right? We're talking about sex. Okay. So gender is sort of a, you know, wholly more like world's complex topic, right? So let's try and keep it just to
Oh
sex.
yeah, sorry, I
To
meant
be
sex.
no. That's fine. You know, the reason that I say that is because it helps clarify, you know, things outside of the biology classroom as well. You know. Okay, so yeah, so you get the embryo, it develops into a sporophyte. The sporophyte, remember, these are plants, right? So the sporophyte is in essence male and female. Okay, what is a male, right? A male produces, so when we talk about animals, right, a male produces sperm, a female produces eggs, right? Here you have an organism that is producing, that will eventually produce egg and sperm. So it's both, right? So it's not like now there are plants, but this is not what we're talking about right now. There are plants where you have males and you have females, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about a plant that that has the ability to be both male and female. Okay, now when that differentiation really starts to go from both to potential to produce both to potential to produce either one or the other, that's with the development of the microsporangium or megasporangium, right? So basically, you're going to have these specialized spore producing not spore producing, I shouldn't say that, but you know, gamete producing tissue, and it's going, and that's why before, mention of ovaries and testes, right, that are going to end up producing the egg and sperm. Okay, so if you think about the gametophytes being, the microspore and the megaspore being similar to, oh, the megaspore is similar to an ovary that produces an egg. It's that kind of a thing. Does that help at all? And you have to tell me if it doesn't, because we'll try and attack it from a different direction.
Yeah, that helps. I understand the gametophytes, but it's just I guess what I didn't
Sporophyte.
understand was this where the sporophytes differentiated, like where in the cycle.
Yeah, right. So it's really, and I think you can see my cursor, right? It's in this area. That's where you're sort of, suddenly there's tissue that's going to specialize in what it's going to end up producing down in this
Can I
area.
just pop in right here, Professor?
Yeah.
I would suggest that the way that I think of it is that the sporophyte is kind of like our bodies, like everything about our bodies except for our reproductive system. And then you think of the gametophyte as the reproductive system. And so it's kind of like we are made of both reproductive system and then our somatic body, which is, everything else, whatever, liver cells, heart cells, skin cells. And so we are all in one unit, but for these plants, they are spatially separated, the reproductive system and then the like sort of regular or somatic section. So I think that's one way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I think that
I
works.
definitely see it that way. I see it that way already, but I just wanted to know I guess the little details about how the sporophyte differs, like what kind of mechanisms inside of it are working to determine that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. No, I think that works. Adam, you have a hand up.
So, do spores and like seeds mainly differ because spores are unicellular?
Do spores and seeds differ
Because I
because
said they have
seeds?
the same function dispersal.
Yeah, so they have the same function, but how they end up achieving it is vastly different, right? So again, you've got different levels of complexity. So the spore is going to be the most basic level of having this sort of, gamete. Then you can have the next level up would be like I mentioned before with the gymnosperms, with the naked seeds, right? And then you've got the seeds, and those seeds can be really complex. So it's not just about how many cells there are, but it's not a bad way of
Yeah.
sort of trying to help classify it into different levels of complexity. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Got it. Any other questions, guys? Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.
Professor?